Battle of Antietam, September 17, 1862, in the American Civil War, 1861–65, a decisive engagement that halted the Confederate invasion of Maryland, an advance that was regarded as one of the greatest Confederate threats to Washington, D.C. The Union name for the battle is derived from Antietam Creek, which flows south from Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, to the Potomac River near Harper's Ferry, West Virginia. In the South, the encounter was referred to as the Battle of Sharpsburg because the main fighting took place near the town of that name. Civil War battles often had one name in the North, which was usually associated with a prominent nearby physical feature, and another in the South, which was usually derived from the town or city closest to the battlefield. Lee's invasion of Maryland. Following the defeat of Union General John Pope's Army of Virginia at the Second Battle of Bull Run, Confederate General Robert E. Lee crossed the Potomac and moved into Maryland, occupying Frederick on September 7th. Lee's invasion was carried out partly to shift the burden of military occupation from Confederate to federal soil, but he also held some hope of capturing the federal capital of Washington to the southeast. Beyond the immediate military objectives, Lee had concrete political goals: to influence the approaching congressional elections in the North, to impress Europe with a sense of Southern military power, and to detach Maryland, a slave state that had rejected secession, from the Union. Finding his line of communications up the Shenandoah Valley threatened by a strong Union garrison at Harper's Ferry, on September 9th, Lee issued Special Order 191, in which he detailed the division and disposition of forces for the campaign ahead. General Thomas Stonewall Jackson would lead one of 3 columns that were tasked with the capture of Harper's Ferry, while the remainder of Lee's forces would advance to Boonesboro, Maryland, behind South Mountain, a ridge that ran parallel to Antietam Creek. Once the Union force at Harper's Ferry had been neutralized, Lee proposed to reunite his army and invade Pennsylvania. Within days of the Union disaster at Second Bull Run, U.S. President Abraham Lincoln sacked Pope and placed General George B. McClellan in command of all Union forces in Washington. McClellan took the field on September 7th, and not knowing what Lee's next move might be, he advanced with characteristic slowness. During this time, Lee again divided his army, and on September 11th, he and Lieutenant General James Longstreet occupied Hagerstown, Maryland, a city just 5 miles, 8 kilometers, south of the Mason-Dixon line. The stubborn federal garrison at Harper's Ferry bought McClellan additional time, however, delaying the bulk of the Army of Northern Virginia for several days longer than had been budgeted in Lee's timetable. Already sensing that his invasion plan had gone awry, Lee began to withdraw to the south. Confederate scouts had observed massive columns of Federal infantry on the move, and Lee ordered Major General D.H. Hill to guard the passes at South Mountain. If McClellan could drive through these passes before Lee could reunite his army, the Army of Northern Virginia could be destroyed in detail. On September 13th, Federal troops moved into Frederick, and members of the 27th Indiana Infantry Regiment recovered a copy of Lee's Special Order 191, wrapped around a bundle of cigars. Although the lost orders were 4 days old, McClellan felt emboldened enough to remark, "Here is a paper with which, if I cannot whip Bobby Lee, I will be willing to go home." On September 14th, McClellan's army struck the passes at South Mountain. The Battle of South Mountain was a convincing Union victory, but the Confederate defenders managed to delay the Union advance long enough for Lee to begin the consolidation of his scattered forces. On the morning of September 15th, the 12,000 beleaguered defenders of Harper's Ferry finally capitulated. At the cost of fewer than 300 Confederate casualties, Jackson had won one of the great unheralded victories of the American Civil War. Leaving Major General A.P. Hill to complete the surrender arrangements, Jackson, with 2 divisions, hastened back to the new Confederate defensive line at Antietam Creek. McClellan's forces streamed through the South Mountain passes to find Lee's army, which numbered perhaps 11,000 men, on the afternoon of September 15th, occupying the heights north of Sharpsburg. McClellan had estimated that total Confederate strength in the area amounted to not less than 120,000 men, an estimate that more than doubled Lee's actual strength, and he spent September 16th engaging in reconnaissance of the Confederate positions. Jackson, by way of an overnight forced march, reached Sharpsburg on the afternoon of September 16th, effectively doubling Lee's strength. Late in the day, elements of Union Major General Joseph Hooker's 1st Corps crossed the upper Antietam on the Confederate left. There, a brief but sharp skirmish erupted with Jackson's men, but night soon put an end to the contest, the Civil War's bloodiest day. On September 17, 1862, the Army of Northern Virginia occupied a position which, in relation to the surrounding country, could be compared to the string of a bow in the act of being drawn. Lee's left wing, commanded by Jackson, formed the upper half of the string, and his right, commanded by Longstreet, the lower. The Potomac, at his rear, was the bow itself. The town of Sharpsburg represented the fingers of the archer, drawing the bow. The right wing of the position was covered by the Antietam as it approached the Potomac, and the upper course of that stream formed no part of the battlefield. A.P. Hill's division had remained at Harper's Ferry, but on the morning of the 17th Hill received orders to rejoin Lee with all haste. The Union 2nd Corps, under Major General 1st Corps, under Major General Joseph Mansfield, followed Hooker across the upper stream, while McClellan's left wing, Major General Ambrose Burnside's 9th Corps, drew up opposite Lee's extreme right. McClellan, fearing a counterattack from a phantom Confederate juggernaut, intended to hold back his center while pressuring Lee's flanks. In practice, McClellan's piecemeal commitment of forces negated his own overwhelming numerical superiority. Battle for the Cornfield and Bloody Lane. The battle began at dawn with a furious assault on the extreme Confederate left by Hooker's corps. After a brutal struggle over what came to be known as the Cornfield, Hooker was repulsed with the loss of a quarter of his men. Hooker himself was shot in the foot and was carried from the field. Command of his corps passed to Brigadier General George Meade. Jackson's divisions suffered even more severely, losing nearly all their generals and colonels. It was only the arrival of Brigadier General John B. Hood and D.H. Hill which enabled Jackson's corps to hold its ground near the Dunker Church. Had other Federal corps been at hand to support Hooker's attack, the outcome of the battle might have been very different. Major General Joseph Mansfield's 12th Corps next attacked farther to the left and with better fortune. Mansfield, however, was mortally wounded, and his command passed to Brigadier General Alpheus Williams, who led the corps well. After heavy fighting, Hood and D.H. Hill were driven back. Again, want of support checked the Federals, and the fight became stationary, with both sides losing many thousands of men. Sumner now came into action, and overhaste involved him in a catastrophe. Attacked in front and flank, his troops were driven back in great confusion, with nearly half their number killed and wounded. The remnants of Mansfield's corps would be pulled back in the retreat that followed. Soon afterwards, the Federal divisions of Brigadier General William French and Major General Israel B. Richardson attacked D.H. Hill, whose men were now exhausted by continuous fighting. Here occurred the fighting in the Bloody Lane, a sunken road north of Sharpsburg, which French and Richardson eventually carried. D.H. Hill's men had fought the Battle of South Mountain and had already been fully engaged 3 times on this day. Hill would lose some 2/3 of his entire command, including 25 of 34 field officers. Proper support would have enabled the Federals to crush Lee's center, but 6th Corps, under Major General William B. Franklin, and V Corps, under Major General Fitzjohn Porter, held in reserve, were not allowed by McClellan to move forward, and the opportunity passed. The battle for Burnside Bridge, Burnside, on the southern end of the Union lines, had received his orders late and acted on them later still. The battle was over on the Confederate right before Burnside fired a shot, and Lee was able to shift nearly all of his troops from his southern wing to support Jackson in the north. At last, Burnside moved forward, but his advance was immediately checked by a handful of men left to oppose him at what came to be known as Burnside Bridge. Fewer than 500 Georgia sharpshooters covered nearly a mile of ground from the bridge south to Snavely's Ford, the only other practicable crossing of the Antietam in the area. These men turned the stone bridge into a killing zone, and Burnside spent more than 3 hours trying to force a crossing of the creek. With their ammunition all but exhausted, the Confederate defenders were at last driven back by a Federal bayonet charge. Burnside now crossed the Antietam with over 8,000 men, and at about 3 p.m., he launched an attack on the 2,000 or so Confederate soldiers who had retired to the heights east of Sharpsburg. Burnside began to roll up Lee's right flank, and it seemed that the Army of Northern Virginia would not survive the day. It was then that the rebel yell erupted from a force on Burnside's left flank. A.P. Hill's troops, freshly armed and resupplied from the stores at Harper's Ferry, had marched 17 miles in just 8 hours, arriving, as Hill reported, not in a moment too soon. In some cases, Union troops, seeing soldiers in blue uniforms, held their fire, only to realize too late that these were Hill's men in clothing that had been taken from Harper's Ferry. Hill's attack shattered the Union advance, and by 4:30 p.m., the Federal left flank was in full retreat. The repulse of Burnside effectively ended the battle. Pressure was brought to bear on McClellan to renew the engagement, but he refused, and Lee crossed the Potomac unmolested. This ended the fighting on what would be the single bloodiest day in the history of the U.S. Armed Forces. Casualties and aftermath, McClellan's conduct of the battle, and his orders for September 18th indicate that he expected another attack by Lee. Rather than attempting to land a finishing blow on the battered Army of Northern Virginia, McClellan was relieved when Lee retired into Virginia. The South had lost 10,316 troops, and the North had suffered casualties of 12,401. Casualties were especially high among general officers, with 6 generals, 3 Union, 3 Confederate, being killed and a dozen more being wounded. In addition to protecting the federal capital, the battle is sometimes cited as having influenced Great Britain not to recognize the Confederacy. President Abraham Lincoln used the occasion of the Antietam victory to issue his preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, September 22, 1862, announcing that unless the Confederates laid down their arms by January 1, 1863, he would free all slaves not residing in Union-controlled territory. The battlefield became a national military park in 1890, and jurisdiction passed to the National Park Service in 1933.